Thank you, President Paul. I would rather be in Maastricht right now, but as they say here, every cloud has a silver lining. Or perhaps I should say, I should quote actually Johan Cruijff here, who once famously stated, ieder nadeel heb zijn voordeel. Ik kan jullie nu gewoon vanuit Harvard toespreken, als het moet, ook in het Nederlands. Now, post-coronavirus, we're not there yet. And maybe that before jumping straight to post-coronavirus, it might be a good idea to first talk briefly about pre-coronavirus. You see, I followed, pardon me here, this should be moved out of the screen. I started teaching at Harvard almost 40 years ago, a long time. And when I started teaching at Harvard, I never asked myself, how am I going to teach? I did what my professors had done to me, lecturing. That was all I knew. There were no, learning centers. There was no training for pedagogy or anything. I was asked to teach. I'm showing here a very old picture of me teaching at Harvard. This picture was taken BC. No, I'm not that old. It was taken before computers. As you can see, I was using an overhead projector. Now, I was asked to teach a course that none of my colleagues wanted to teach, physics for pre-medical students. These were not students who wanted to learn physics. No, they had to because it was a requirement, and they already hated physics before setting foot into my classroom. Now, why did I lecture to them? I did that because I projected my own experience on them. I had learned physics sitting in a classroom not very different from that one, listening to my professors lecture to me. And I'm sure that they too, when they started teaching, made the same assumption. I learned it by listening to a lecture, therefore I'm going to teach by lecturing. And that same way back, generation after generation after generation, all the way until this guy here, which is Henry VIII, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, giving a guest lecture at the University of Bologna. And look carefully, it's not that different from a current scene in any type of auditorium setting. We no longer wear those gowns other than usually at commencement. I guess if I would have been there, I would have worn one for this event. But look carefully. The people in the front row are paying close attention. In the second row, they're looking a little bit more bored. And in the last row, they're not paying any attention to the lecture at all, but having a conversation. And then there is this person here in the back row. I don't know if he or she's asleep or in agony, but you have to agree, it's not very different from the scene you saw before. Now, I received really high evaluations for my lecturing, in spite of the fact that these were students who did not want to learn physics. So very quickly, and they also did well on what I considered were difficult exams. So very quickly, I started to believe that I was the world's best physics teacher. Well, it turned out that was a complete illusion. And when many years later, I tested them on their understanding using very simple word-based questions, or using questions that put the physics in a different context from the one in which they had learned, I discovered they weren't actually able to answer those, in my mind, easy questions. That's when I realized that what I was doing was merely transferring information to the students. But education is so much more than information transfer. Students need to make sense of the information. And if you stop to think about it, in the traditional approach to teaching, the emphasis on campus is on the information transfer in the form of a synchronous instructor-paced lecture. And the hard part, the sense making here, is left on the students on their own. Yes, maybe some of the sense making happens in the classroom. But if you ask yourself, where did things really click? Where did you have the aha moments that permitted you to make sense of the information? Well, it's mostly outside of the classroom. If you ask yourself also, which is the hardest of the two parts, the sense making or the information transfer, I think we all agree it's the sense making. Now, had I been in this mode in March when we went online, I would have moved the information transfer online using Zoom and given a online lecture that is paced by the instructor and still synchronous. Now, because many of my students are outside of the US and not in the same time zone as myself, I had some students in Europe, some in Africa, some in New Zealand, you record the lecture. And now some students are watching the recorded instructor-paced lecture asynchronously. And in the process, they are completely alone. They're alone in the information transfer part. They're alone in the sense-making part. And deep down, education is a synchronous activity, is a social activity, not an isolated, lonely activity. So we would have taken a perhaps already broken model to education and made it even worse. Luckily, I was not in that situation. Because when I discovered back some 30 years ago that my lecturing wasn't really very effective, even though it got high ratings and it got my students to the point that they could actually solve textbook problems, not real problems, but textbook problems. When I discovered that my lecturing didn't really work that well, I radically changed my approach. I switched from teaching by telling to teaching by questioning. So I asked my students to take responsibility for the easy part, the information transfer. They read my notes before coming to class. And then in class, as I said, I taught by questioning, a method I call peer instruction for reasons that you'll see in just a moment. So I ask a question, I give students time to think about the question. They're sitting silently in class for a minute or two. Then I asked them to commit to an answer and I polled them. Initially, I did that by having them put their hands on their chest, using their fingers to indicate the choice. Later, we used clickers and then ultimately a response system on their cellular phones. I try to aim the question so that half of them get the right answer and half of them do not get the right or desired answer. I then tell my students, find a neighbor who has a different answer and try to convince that neighbor that you are right and he or she is wrong. Complete chaos in the classroom. They talk. But what happens is that the students who have the right or desired answer, on average, convince those who do not have the right answer. I then repoll them, and if we start with something like 50% of correct or desired answers, it's not unusual to end with 80% or more correct answer. Because during that discussion, that's when the aha moments occur. Oh, yes, now I get it. I then end with an explanation, which can come from me or from one of the students, and that cycle repeats until the time is up. Now, during that discussion, that's the key point, because that's when students, you know, convince one another of the correct answer. And they do that more effectively than I would. Why? Because they have only recently learned it. They'll still know what the difficulty is that a beginning learner has. They don't suffer from what my colleague Steven Pinker at Harvard calls the curse of knowledge. I've forgotten the difficulty that a beginning learner faces. They have not. So using that method over the years, I, and later many others in different fields, showed significantly higher learning gains. So here's the normalized learning gain that I obtained with lecturing. I tripled it using peer instruction, and similar results have been shown in other disciplines. And on top of that, there's better retention. So when the pandemic hit, I already on campus was simply teaching by synchronous peer instruction, focusing on the hard part of education, the sense making. And the students were taking care asynchronously and at their own pace about the asynchronous pre-class part. So when we moved on campus, off campus online, it was actually very easy for me. The information transfer took place on a platform that was already online and that was interactive. And the online part, the sense making part, was also interactive. And using Zoom breakout rooms, it was very easy to replicate the in class experience. So now both the information transfer part and the sense making part were fully interactive. We did not lose a sense of community by going from campus to going online. And rather than even isolating the students even more than they were already isolated, we continued this interactivity once we moved online. I want to close here by actually pointing out two words or reflecting briefly on two words I used. I used the word synchronous and asynchronous, and I used the word self-paced and instructor-paced. One of the things that I found over the summer is that there are many parts in activity that we do synchronously and at the pace of the instructor for no other good reason than that is what we were forced to do because of teaching in auditoria. But as we move online and as we think about education post coronavirus, it would be good to ask oneself about each activity that you do in the classroom. Does this need to be asynchronous? Sorry, synchronous. Does this need to be instructor-led? What do I mean by synchronous? By synchronous, I mean everybody together, instructor and students, at the same time. And if you have a classroom, there's no other choice because you all need to be in the classroom at the same time. And then by paced, I mean instructor paced, I mean everybody together at the same pace, as if education is a conveyor belt where everybody moves at the same pace. But we know that not everybody learns at the same pace at all times or at the same pace as everybody else. So if you think of a lecture is synchronous and it's instructor paced. If you think of a recorded lecture, that's asynchronous. You can do it whenever you can watch it whenever you want, but it's still instructor paced. Although you could pause it, but most students put the playback speed at 2.0 to get through it as fast as they can. A lab is synchronous. Everybody needs to be in the laboratory at the same time, but at least it's self-paced. Homework or study is asynchronous and self-paced. And over the summer, I realized that there were many activities that I could move from synchronous to asynchronous and from instructor paced to self-paced. And here's the key point, which I'd like to leave you with as we wrap up this little discussion, this little talk here. I hope to have a discussion after this. The more you do this, the more you move from synchronous to asynchronous. And the more you move from instructor-paced to self-paced, the more time we make available for us as instructors to help students where it really matters. So I have, for this coming semester, reserved almost all of my face-to-face time with the students to be more in a mentorship role where I can help them and give individualized instructions, and left all the other parts of my teaching through recorded video, through interactive exercises where the students interact with each other and I'm present through pre-recorded video, by having that being completely asynchronous and self-paced. And I know that that is the future towards improving education. And I also know that whenever it will be, Harvard has decided to be online or remote, as they call it, for the entire academic year. But let's say that next academic year, a year from now, we actually move back to the classroom. I know that even I will not go back to education the way it was before. So I'm going to leave you here and open the floor for discussion. I know I've glossed over many details, so I prepared a handout about my remote teaching that you may want to look at later on. And also I put the slides online, and I look also very much forward to digging deeper in the webinar I will be giving a week from now. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Eric. And of course, you know, we at Maastricht University share a lot of your ideas, but it's always good to pick each other's brains. And again, I would mention that we have an in-depth webinar with Eric Mazur scheduled for next week. You can subscribe to this webinar through our webpage. But I also would like to ask a few questions. We have some questions that we got via email. And one question that I see is, do you think that asynchronous lectures have a value at all? Because we do asynchronous lecture next to our problem-based learning system.
I think that is a very good question. And had you asked me this question at the beginning of the summer, I would have probably said, you know, with a lot of emphasis, no. Because essentially what happens is that you take something where the student is already passive, and then you move it online, where what is going to happen is that the student is going to put the playback speed at 1.5 or 2.0 to try to get through it as fast as they can alone. So that was my mental model of a recorded lecture. However, and I'll go into more detail in the webinar, there's a possibility to layer something over that recorded lecture, which is an asynchronous interactive discussion between the students. In other words, if you load the recorded lecture into a platform that permits students to interact with each other and annotate the video, you know, you listen to a pre-recorded lecture, and at some point you think, I wonder what this really means. I thought that if blah, 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 and so on. You can stop the video, make the annotation, other students see the annotation and can reply to it, not synchronously, this would happen asynchronously, so that later you can return and say, oh yeah, I now understand what happens there. So I've actually radically changed my mind over the summer. I think if you just make the recording available and you have the students passively watching, then the answer is no. But if you layer interactivity over it and engagement, because that's what it really is about, it's ultimately about engaging the minds of our students, then I think there is actually some value and possibly significant value to having a pre-recorded lecture.
Okay, thank you. Here's another interesting one that certainly is playing at our community. What's the best way to organize assessment in a online virtual education world? And I remember that you once have written that assessment is the killer of learning, if I remember that correctly. So what is your view on that?
You know, until 5 minutes before I started here, I was working on the assessment page on our on the Canvas site for my course, which kicks off on Thursday. Yes, I mean, think about it. Information transfer, sense making. I talked about it in the context of instruction, but I think that contrast is just as important in assessment. And as we move online, assessing information transfer is useless because the student is already sitting at the computer and you have information at your fingertips. And think about it, a lot of assessment that happens worldwide, from what I know about Maastricht University, you've evolved significantly beyond that, but worldwide, a lot of assessment consists of isolating students from each other and isolating them from any source of information and testing recall of information. That system is completely broken and impossible online. So I think we need to not only, and I'm very grateful for this question, we need to not only rethink our approach to instruction, we need to rethink our approach to assessment and get away from the lowest level thinking skill, namely memorization, and really try to find ways to assess higher level thinking skill. In particular, I would say the benefit of moving online is that it forces us to do this, because any question to which the answer can be Googled is no longer a valid, and was never, in my opinion, a valid assessment question, because it essentially tests a skill that is meaningless in the 21st century. You, I, all of us Google information all the time. It's not about memorizing it, it's knowing how to find the information and how to use the information. So two things need to happen to make assessment effective online. One is we need to move to higher order thinking skills, at the least understanding, but ideally analysis, evaluation, and perhaps even more creative skills at the top of Bloom's taxonomy, which is a taxonomy, if you want, of thinking skills. That's one thing. The second thing is that rather than having very periodic, but distantly spaced in time, high stakes assessment opportunity, we should do a continuous assessment. I have moved my assessment completely to a specifications grading scheme, where students are not measured on how much they know at some specific instance, 2, 3, maybe 4 over the semester, but they're measured, their assessment is based on how many units they master by the end of the semester. And I hope that we'll have an opportunity to talk about that more, but that's essentially the two key points that are so important in this coronavirus time and the post-coronavirus time.
Thank you. We have a number of questions here, but I would, in the spirit of time, refer them to the webinar. They will surely all be answered. And as I said earlier, everybody is invited to participate, students and teachers alike. Again, thank you very much, Eric, for these inspirations, which will help us in the future discussions. Thanks for joining us from Harvard.